Good morning, everyone. You realize after singing like that, whatever I say is going to be a letdown, right? Let's set our expectations low. Good. Thanks, Tyler. Thank you for that. All right, everyone. Need to be here today. So we've been back a little over a year now, and I appreciate everybody that checks in with us from time to time to make sure I'm driving on the correct side of the road and all the different things. I do appreciate that. And I think a lot of you ask questions, and I think because you genuinely care about me. Not you, Tyler. You do not genuinely care about me. Let's offer an invitation for Tyler right now. No, people ask all the time, how did you fit in down there? And I think what your people are really asking is, Mike, you are so odd and so strange. How could you possibly connected with people in a different culture? We don't even understand you, and you're from here. And that's my father-in-law speaking, Baxter. People do ask that question. It is weird because Australia, living down there for 10 years or so, you sort of get used to different things, and I think people got used to us, but there are a lot of British sensibilities there, a lot of Australian sensibilities, and I've meshed okay, I guess. But let me just tell you one story that's sort of a microcosm of what it was like to be down there. So as the chaplain at this school, we had 3 schools within that college. We had the junior school, the middle school, and the senior school, and once a year we'd have an awards night where more often than not I would be the host or the MC or the compere or whatever, and I would certainly get things started by welcoming everybody and saying a prayer at the beginning. Usually what would happen is after a time of people just mingling, they would have the national anthem, the Australian national anthem, and then I would walk up and welcome and say the prayer. And so these are early days, and this is the awards night. For the junior school, there's probably 1,000 or so people, maybe more than that are their parents. This is the last event of the year. They do the national anthem, and I'm trying to time it because I'm off stage, and the podium is so far out on stage. It's probably 2 miles away. 2 miles might be a bit of a stretch. Probably just a mile. Anyway, thank you, Greg. The podium is so far away from where I am, and so I start walking to time it, so I'm going to get there right when the song is over. And I do. I get there right as the music starts to die down. I'm getting ready to say the prayer, and the band starts up and starts the second verse, which nobody ever does. And I'm standing out there. The only thing I can think to do is walk backwards like this. And I did all the way back to where I'd started from. And then after it was over, some of my friends were like, "Oh, you're cheeky, Mr. Shepherd, you're cheeky." That's my best Australian accent, which it sounds more like somebody from England, 1800s. Anyway, so I know that I'm awkward. I was awkward there. I'm awkward here. I'm socially awkward. I'm awkward at home. That's about all I've got this morning. If you feel that that's spoken to you in any way, no. I feel like I'm in good company, though, because we all are strange. We're all different. We all sort of march to our own beat of our own drummer to a certain extent. And not only that, but if we look at God's Word, if we look at the Bible, it's full of people that have their issues, that are awkward, that are different, that don't see things the way everybody else does, and that's a good thing. Our great heroes of faith in the Old Testament and the New Testament are people that were flawed, but God still desperately wanted to work with them and through them and in spite of them, and that still carries over into today. There's some great heroes of faith in God's Word. They're all throughout there, and this morning we're going to look at Elijah. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 18 is where we're going to be, and one of the things about Elijah that comes to mind is this great showdown that he had, and we're going to talk about that and a couple other things this morning. It's a very unique story that Elijah has, but it's almost reminiscent of Westerns. I love movies. Our family grew up liking movies. I still like movies today. I have a fond spot in my heart for the good classic Western movie with some showdowns. I've got some pictures of some of these things. My mother took me to a couple of Western movies. Do we have pictures of them? We have these. Let's sing the song again. George. No. All right. Just imagine a classic Western scene there. I tell you what, I picked out some great images from Google. Well, can you see? Can you make this out? It's awesome. Well, 1 Kings chapter 18. Oh, okay. Too late. I've already changed my mind. I want to use them. No, I'm kidding. So, Westerns have this great showdown scene where things come up and, they're going to have this big battle. And it carries on even today. Even when you get to the Avengers, there's a great showdown scene in the Avengers. And even when you get to Star Wars, there's always a great showdown scene in Star Wars. But look, one of the greatest showdowns that we know of happens in God's Word. And it's this story of Elijah when he goes up against the prophets of Baal. It's in 1 Kings chapter 18, and we don't know a lot about Elijah's backstory. He just sort of comes up on the scene, and he starts to prophesy in the times of King Ahab, and Jezebel is there. And we don't know sort of a lot of the circumstances surrounding how he was brought up and all these things. And sometimes when we think about prophecy, we think about people that are telling the future. It really just means somebody that speaks on behalf of God. And so at the time of King Ahab, this very unique individual by the name of Elijah shows up on the scene. And he begins to prophesy for God. And he's not very popular. Part of the uniqueness about all the prophets is they weren't that popular. And if you sort of try and gauge success, they weren't that successful because a lot of people didn't buy into their message. But they were still faithful, and Elijah was certainly that. And so in 1 Kings chapter 18, we're going to read verse 19. It says to this, preparing for this showdown between the prophets of Baal, says, "Now bring all the prophets of Israel to Mount Carmel with all 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who are supported by Jezebel." So Ahab summoned all the people and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How long are you going to waver between two opinions?" And I think we can all identify with this concept of wavering between two things. But these people are wavering between two opinions. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. But the people were completely silent. The story continues. We're going to go to verse 23. "Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God." And all the people agreed. And I know that there's more beyond that. We're just going to look at some of the highlights of this story. And we know that there's some trenches that are dug, there's water that's involved. And part of the reason for this is because historically we're pretty sure that the prophets of Baal did things like this on occasion to show the power of Baal, but they had it rigged and they had this fire set up to go no matter what. And so Elijah goes to all these extremes to make sure that when he knows what's going to happen, that people are going to know this is on the up and up, that this is a legitimate miracle from God. So we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 27. And so we're fast forwarding it just a bit in the story. "About noontime, Elijah began mocking them, saying, 'You'll have to shout louder,' he scoffed, 'for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or maybe he is away on a trip, or he is asleep and needs to be awakened.'" So he's full of all this stuff, and he's full of all this confidence, and he speaks out to these prophets and to the crowds that are there, and he knows that he's standing with God, and he can stand with assurance because of that. And he knows that God is God, and he has complete confidence and complete assurance as he stands in front of that crowd. Now, I know we're reading this text thousands of years later, and we know how the story's going to go, but keep in mind, when this happened, Elijah's just standing there as the voice of God, and he's still standing with confidence. I think the takeaway for us today is that as we go through life and as we go against the flow and as we sort of live life differently on God's terms, that we can stand with assurance, whatever's happening. If things at work aren't that great, if family life's not too fantastic, if there's health issues, despite all of that, we can stand with assurance because we know that God is still God and God is in charge of whatever happens if we continue to give our lives back to him. When I just received a message earlier this week, when we were in Australia, we planted all these different types of works. We started a congregation there. We had a ladies ministry. We had a kids club that we started, and they just texted me this week saying we were celebrating 5 years of that work. So I'm really proud of that, of what God has done there. And one of the first things that we did after we'd met together for a few months is that we had this retreat, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but it was a new concept for what we were doing with this age group in this part of the world. And we took them on this ferry to this little island just southeast of Australia. It was just about a 45-minute ferry ride. And we thought, what did we want the theme of the weekend to be? And somebody said, why don't we say for these kids that are 8, 9, 10, and 11 that the theme is God's got your back? because we want them to know that whatever happens in life, that God is looking out for them and God is walking with them, and that we can stand with assurance. And that was a thing that we didn't just use for the weekend. We used it for the rest of the year, because the truth of it is that whatever happens, we can stand with assurance as we stand with God, just like Elijah did in that case. I went to elementary school in Decatur. Went to a school called Woodmead. And, I think it works the same pretty much anywhere in America. If you're going to buy lunch, you get, I think it's about usually $1 for a lunch. Your parents might give you $5 at the beginning of the week, or a $1 bill for each day. Maybe it's gone up. I don't know. My dad gave me $1 for lunch when we lived in Decatur. And so I was new to the whole school thing and about how school lunches worked. And so as I got there, I'm a young guy, probably first grade, second grade. This guy, I'm going to use a code name. His name was Brent. That's not his real name. He came up to me and was like, outside of the school office, like, "Are you trying to eat school lunch? School lunch money." And I didn't know so I didn't know if he worked for the school or what, so I gave him my money. And later on, when I was standing in line, I was like, "I paid Brent." And they were like, "Brent? What?" "Yes, Brent." And Brent was, Brent's over there eating 2 lunches. And so it was a scam. I was being bullied here. This guy's taking my lunch money. I didn't tell anybody. I started losing a little bit of weight. And my dad's talking to me. He's like, "Son, are you not buying?" So he gets word back, "I'm not buying these lunches." I'm like, "Well, I'm not buying lunch, but Brent seems to really enjoy them." And so my dad got so mad, and I was like, "No, Dad, I don't even like lunch. Who likes lunch?" And he's going to go down there. He's going to talk to the principal, and they do, and they had this big powwow, and they begin to come up with this plan. This is no joke. Their plan was for me to set Brent up in front of them, and so. They plan this on a Friday. My dad gives me $5. I can't even sleep. I'm so excited about how this is going to happen. Give me $5, and so I'm standing outside the office at Woodmead School on the Monday, and Brent's coming out there ready to get paid my protection. I got to pay my protection money to him, and so I know that my dad and the principal are hiding, no joke, behind a bush just right over here, right in front of this. And I've got this $5 bill. He's like, "Give me that $5. Like, "What, this $5, Brent?" I'm like making a big deal out of it because I know what's going to happen. He's like, "Yeah, give me that $5. And so the minute he took that $5 from me, no joke, the principal and my dad jumped out of this bush. I don't know why they just didn't come around the bush, but they jump out of the bush. I'm not exactly sure if this really happened in real life, this part. I think they had badges made for this thing, and they're like, "Hey, we got you." And I do remember them taking Brent to the principal's office, and pretty sure Brent looked over and said, "I'll see you on the playground, Shepherd." If that spoke to you in any way, come forward now. I was so confident about what was going to happen. I was so excited because I knew that my dad and the principal had this thing sorted. And as we go through the day-to-day stuff, look, we serve a powerful God. And we can stand with assurance whatever happens because we know God is watching over us and looking out for us. Elijah is a unique character, and this unique story continues. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 37. So we skipped about 10 verses. And I would encourage you maybe this afternoon to read this whole story. "O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the ditch. And when the people saw it, they fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord is God. The Lord is God." And if you'll notice there, that word there, when they saw what happened, they cried out and said, "The Lord is God." And what Elijah's doing there, even in this time of prophecy and great prophets, is he's pointing out God's power. This is something that God's done. Elijah's not going around setting fire to things. This is the power of God. And while there is a time and a place for spectacle, and this is certainly something that's great and magnificent that happened, probably the most powerful thing that people see this day and age is God's power in a changed life. When we go to work on Monday, and we go to work on Tuesday, and we're in the marketplace, or we're at school, wherever we are, and there's a changed life, and people can point out God's power in that changed life, that's powerful. The story of Paul, if you go back and you look at his story from his conversion, he preached to a myriad of audiences. His sermon was almost always the same. It was the story of what he was like before God and the story of who he was after he met God. And it was the power of that changed life that people saw, if they were kings or if they were just people on the street corner. And our challenge today is to point out God's power in our life. The story goes on, though. Some people stop there with this great victory, and it is a tremendous victory that God accomplishes through Elijah. But a lot of times people sort of stop there, because what happens is next is sort of strange. What happens is that Elijah gets a note from Jezebel. She's not too pleased, because she's the one that's brought the prophets of Baal into the kingdom. She's the one that has introduced this worship of Baal to the kingdom. So she's not too happy. So she sends a note to Elijah saying, I'm going to get you, basically. She said, I'm going to kill you. And for whatever reason, it affects Elijah. By the way, if you're a life group leader, I put in there that we're talking about 1 Kings 18, but don't just stop there tonight. This actually spills over into 1 Kings 19. So 1 Kings 19, verses 3 and 4. Elijah was afraid. He gets this note and fled for his life. He ends up running a marathon. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there, and he went on alone into the desert, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. And what Elijah seems to miss out there is that people don't not follow God because of a lack of evidence. They don't follow God in spite of the evidence. And that's certainly what's happened with with Jezebel here. It's no doubt that Elijah won this, but she still doesn't want to follow God. And so what ends up happening, for whatever reason, and some people read this and they don't get, Elijah has had this great victory, and they don't understand why Elijah runs forward and runs to this cave. I get it. I understand it. I like solitude, and this is what Elijah has. He has this time of solitude. And what's happening here is he's retreating for restoration. Elijah's taking this time to reconnect with God, and God's going to reconnect with him. He retreats for restoration. We live in I suspect just about everybody in here has a cell phone. I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation with somebody, maybe talking on the phone, or more likely than not, maybe texting somebody, and the conversation is going really good, and then it just stops, and you're like, what? And you don't know, and you're like, what's happening? You want somebody to text you back, and for whatever reason it stops. Maybe their phone died or your phone died. And I remember one time when we were in Australia, and our chaplaincy team at the college had grown, and there was a few of us, and we were trying to sort out something on a Friday afternoon, something very serious with one of our students. And we're trying to figure out if we're going to have to call it family services or something, and we were having this pretty intense texting conversation. All of a sudden it just stopped. The bubble stopped. No, there was nothing else happening. I was like, what? We were in the middle of a conversation. It was probably 10 or 15 minutes that went by, and I got a phone call from a different number, and it was like, oh, sorry, Shep, my phone died. And they had to reconnect it and let it charge up. We understand that imagery. But it happens to us spiritually too, that we have to retreat for restoration. We have to take times to be reconnected to God. And it might come in the form of solitude like it did here for Elijah. Because what flows on next is something that's going to speak deeply into his soul as he retreats for restoration. So we continue the story. Go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound of a gentle whisper, and that's where Elijah heard the voice of God, was in that space. So he retreats for restoration, but then he ends up relying on God's presence that comes to him in the form of this gentle whisper. Sometimes things are so loud that it is hard to hear the voice of God. And so after this great victory, when Elijah has withdrawn and is retreating for restoration, he relies on God's power as he's in this cave, and he hears the voice of God in this gentle whisper. Some of you may be old enough to remember this. If you want to capture someone's attention, you whisper. It was an old commercial from a long, long time ago. My brother thought that was the funniest thing growing up. He was like, who does that? Who whispers to get attention? And when he was beating me up in his room, he would say, why don't you whisper for Mom and Dad to come? Help, help. But the truth is, and studies have borne this out, that if you're trying to get the attention of an audience, you're better served speaking softly so they have to quieten down to hear you than to try and yell over the crowd. And I don't think God likes to compete for our attention. God wants us to listen for him in the gentle whisper. And we rely on God. You can go to the next slide. And we rely on God's presence. I don't know how many of you have had surgery or maybe even had dental work done. You know, my experience with this has been when you go into these places when they're putting you under, you know, the surgeons and the doctors and the nurses, they don't come in there with, you know, a band like, hey, I hope you're resting, you know, get ready to sleep. We're getting ready to do surgery on you. It's more quiet and more docile. They're like, you know, settle down, relax. Where's your ATM? Where's your card? What's your bank numbers? And they talk very softly, so you sort of doze off and quietly. The reason for that is when they're doing surgery on us, when they're performing an operation on us, they need us to be still. You know, they don't do heart surgery on people that are wide awake walking around. Hey, come here, let me get this. You know, they put them in a surgery, you know, a surgery theater, and they begin to operate. And God needs us to slow down sometimes so he can speak to our heart, so he can really work on us and continue to form us in his image as unique people who live a life of adventure. Last week, Frank talked about faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, and that's true. That being said, that doesn't discount the fact that there is faith and hope involved as well. And if you look at the story of Elijah, you see a story of faith, hope, and love. And if you don't know how the story of Elijah ends, I encourage you to read it. We know more about how the story ends than the beginning of his story. It's a fascinating way, the way that his life ends, the way that his story goes out. But it is a life of adventure, of a very unique character who wanted to walk with God desperately. And I think that's where we are. We want to be people that have this life of adventure, that walk with God, and that trust him, and that we give over to his power, and we rely on his presence. My favorite writer, C.S. Lewis, and he wrote a lot of books. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, but also a lot of great theological apologetics books. But he writes in the Chronicles of Narnia, one of the characters in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when they realize they're going to have this adventure, she says, let us go on and take the adventure that shall fall to us. And as we reflect on the life of Elijah this morning, and we think about the coming week and the coming days and all the different things that entails, let's take that adventure on. This morning, if there's something on your heart, as maybe that's piqued your interest as we've talked about this life of Elijah, maybe something that you want to talk about or pray about, this is a time for you to come forward while we stand and sing.